He was 8 years old. He had his mother's eyes and his father's habit of thinking before he spoke. And from the moment he appears in this story, he does one thing, over and over, every time something terrible happens. He looks at his sister instead. Not because he isn't afraid, because he decided, somewhere around age 6 when the trouble started, that being afraid wasn't useful. And so he simply stopped letting himself feel it. Until the night it was finally over. And a boy who had been holding himself straight for 2 years leaned just slightly against his mother's hand. Just slightly. And that fraction of an inch was the most heartbreaking thing in the entire story. This channel lives in these moments, the ones the West doesn't advertise. The tenderness between people who've been through fire together. Children should never have to be brave, but when they are, it is the most sacred thing in the world to witness it. Subscribe and tell me below, do you know a child who is braver than they should have to be? This one's for them.
Cole Hargrove had one simple rule about the East Ridge Road come December. He stayed off it. It was a dead end that ran right into the Peaton mining trail and just gave up. Nobody had any business on that road in a snowstorm, unless they were running from something. Cole was just checking a downed fence line, but his old dog Deputy kept pulling him that way. The dog was 13 and moved with the memory of old hurts, but when he had a mind to go somewhere, you might as well follow. Cole smelled the wreck before he laid eyes on it, wet canvas and the sharp scent of busted pine. His horse stopped dead, ears pinned back, and that's when Cole saw them down the slope. A woman on her knees in the snow, arms wrapped tight around two little ones. Her body was a shield, her dark coat spread like broken wings. She wasn't looking down. She was watching the lights on the ridge, tracking them. Cole sat his horse for a long 3 seconds. He used to be real good at reading a situation, sizing up a threat before most men could even draw a breath. A couple of years of quiet ranch life had slowed him, but not that much. Those lanterns were moving in a sweep pattern. That meant they weren't searching for her. They knew she was down there and were tightening the net, and she knew it too. She was staying low and quiet, praying the snow would cover her tracks. He could just turn back, check the fence another day, and no one would ever know he was there. But Deputy let out a low sound, something between a growl and a whine. It was the sound he made when he'd already made a decision and was just waiting on Cole to get with the program. The little girl peeked out from her brother's coat, and her eyes locked right onto Cole through the falling snow. She didn't make a sound, just watched him. Cole swung down from his horse. "Ma'am," he said, keeping his voice quiet, "don't you move. I'm coming down to you." The woman turned her head. He couldn't see her face clearly, just the hard set of her shoulders. She was holding pain in a place she could deal with later. "How many?" she asked, her voice steady. It wasn't a question, she was getting information. "3 on the ridge. Maybe more I can't see. 2 more south," she said, shifting her weight with a sharp intake of breath. "They're trying to block off the creek road." Cole looked south and saw she was right. A 4th lantern flickered through the trees. In the dark, in a blizzard, with a dislocated shoulder and 2 kids, she had already figured out their whole plan. "My ranch is 1.5 miles west of here," he told her. "There's a draw we can take where they can't see us, but we've got to move now before they clear the next bend." He knelt down to her level. Her face was pale, with a frozen cut over her eye. But her eyes were clear, and they were sizing him up just like he was sizing her up. "You live out here?" she asked. "All alone?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then why are you stopping for us?" It was the right question to ask. "Because," he said slowly, "if I ride on by, I'm going to hear about what happened on this road tomorrow. And I reckon I wouldn't sleep right for a long, long time." He glanced at her shoulder, at the unnatural way her arm hung. "That shoulder needs setting and not out here in the cold." She held his gaze for another second, then looked at her son. "James," she said softly. Take your sister's hand." The boy, who looked to be about 8, gave Cole one long, measuring look. Then, without a word, he took his little sister's hand. They moved through the gully in silence, with Cole leading his horse to block the view from the ridge. The woman, whose name he still didn't know, walked on her own. He offered an arm twice, and she refused. The third time, when her foot slipped on some ice, she grabbed his sleeve just long enough to get her balance, then let go fast. The little girl, who was maybe 5 or 6, looked up at his horse. "What's his name?" "Pepper," Cole said. "That's a good name," she replied with great seriousness. "Deputy is a good name, too." She pointed her chin at the old dog, limping ahead. "How'd you know his name?" "He just looks like a deputy," she said, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. Cole's ranch was cold and dark, but the walls were solid, and the stove caught fire quick. Within 20 minutes, the small room was filled with warmth. He pulled out blankets his mother had sent him 2 years back, blankets he'd never had a reason to use until now. The little girl, Clara, was asleep before the first one settled over her. Her brother James sat bolt upright beside her, his eyes never leaving Cole. He wasn't scared, just watchful, like a boy who'd had to be the man of the house for too long. The woman sat at the table, a leather satchel clutched in her lap. She hadn't put it down for 1 second. Cole had noticed. He set a tin cup of hot water in front of her. "I'm all out of coffee," he said. "This is fine." She wrapped her hands around the cup and closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds before she was back, watching everything. "Your shoulder," he said. "It needs to go back in. It's going to hurt." "I know. You want a warning first, or should I just get it over with?" For a moment, something shifted in her face. Not thanks, just the look of someone who hadn't been asked what she wanted in a long while. "Just do it," she said. He set her arm, found the right angle, and pushed it back into place with one quick movement. She made a single sharp sound, and then there was only the sound of the blizzard outside. After a moment, she thanked him, her voice steady. She introduced herself as Eleanor McBride. Her husband, Thomas, had worked for Peaton Mining. He died 8 months ago in what they called a shaft accident. Her voice was pure ice. She told Cole they were mighty good at filing accidents. She was headed to Billings to find a judge not on Peaton's payroll. She glanced at her bag, explaining that it held her husband's notebook. It contained 4 years of records detailing every crooked deal Peaton Mining had pulled, including the Colville collapse. That name hit Cole like a punch to the gut. He asked what she knew about it. She said she knew 7 men died, and nobody was blamed. Then she looked right at him. She knew a detective named Cole Hargrove wrote a report that blamed Peaton for it, a report that got buried. She knew he quit rather than sign the falsified one. Her husband believed that report was the truth and kept a copy. Cole asked how long she had known who he was. She said she recognized his name the moment he said it. Her husband had made her memorize it just in case. They killed Thomas and called it carelessness. Now they were hunting her because she took the notebook instead of just sitting home and crying. She set her jaw. "I am not grieving quietly." Cole noticed her scraped knuckles and the ink stains on her fingers. Cole saw how she protected that bag. He told her about a federal marshal named Garrett, a man too stubborn to be bought. He said he knew how to find him. She just looked at him and asked why he would help. It was a genuine question from a woman who had learned not to expect anything. Cole felt the weight of the last 2 years. He had walked away telling himself it was enough, but it was a lie. He pointed out that her husband's notebook had the 7 names of the men from Colville. Those names were in his original report, but they were scrubbed from every official record. He locked eyes with her and asked how Thomas got them. She answered softly that he went to the families. He spent 3 months finding every single one. He wrote down everything they told him, she said. He figured someone should have done it already. The weight of that settled on Cole as the blizzard howled outside. Finally, he spoke. The pass to Billings was closed, and they were snowed in for at least 3 days. He told her she and the children needed to sleep. In the morning, they would eat, he would check her shoulder, and she would tell him everything in that notebook. He pointed out the locks on the door. telling her to use them both. When she asked where he was going, he said he and his dog would sleep in the barn. For the first time, he saw a change in her face. It was the look of a woman who had been pushed around for months and was just now being handed a real choice. She said his name, Cole, for the first time. He told her Piton's men would not find them in this storm. Tonight, they were safe. As he opened the door, her boy James spoke up from beside his sleeping sister. His eyes were far too old for his face. "You're going to stand watch, are you not?" the boy asked. Cole just said, "Yes, son." James nodded. "My father used to stand watch," he said, "when he found something worth protecting." Cole stepped out into the storm. The door closed, and he heard both bolts slide into place. On the porch, Cole thought about the 7 names that had been erased. He thought about Thomas McBride, the man who found them again. And he thought about walking away 2 years ago, trying to believe it was enough. He gripped his rifle and took his post. A man stands watch when he finds something worth protecting. The snow was coming down hard, trying to bury the world. But Cole knew that underneath it all, the truth was still there, waiting. In the morning, Eleanor McBride would help him dig it up. The kind of cold that seeps into a man's bones finally drove him inside around 2 in the morning. Slow hands on a rifle are no good to anyone. He came in quietly, but the cabin was not dark. Eleanor was at the table by lantern light, writing in the notebook. "I told you to sleep," he said. She did not look up. "I am copying it. 2 copies are harder to get rid of than 1. Cole sat down across from her as her pencil kept moving. "Thomas taught you that," he said. "He taught me a lot," she replied. She paused for a second. "He said the most dangerous document is the only document. Powerful men do not destroy evidence. They destroy the people holding it." She turned the page. "So, I am making sure more than one person is holding it." Cole just watched her work as the fire burned down to coals. "How long have you been asking questions you already know the answers to?" she asked, her voice tight with pain. "It's an old habit," he said. "You're not a detective anymore." "No, ma'am, I'm not." "Then you can stop acting like one and just ask what you want to know." Cole leaned back in his chair. In the quiet, James shifted in his sleep, putting a protective arm over his sister. "The men on the ridge," Cole said softly. "You knew their formation. People don't learn that by accident. How long have they been after you?" Eleanor set her pencil down. When she finally looked up, her expression wasn't guarded anymore. It was the face of someone deciding how much of a dangerous truth to tell. "Since we left St. Louis," she said. "It started the week after my husband Thomas died. I went to his office to get his things and found a notebook. It was hidden in the back of an old ledger he knew I would find." She rested her hands on the satchel in her lap. "They've been after it and me ever since." The place was clean, too clean. But Eleanor knew her husband's mind. Thomas told her, "If they ever come looking, check the sugar, my winter coat, and the 3rd baseboard in the study." Sure enough, she found the proof he'd hidden, split into 3 parts. Cole stood there, taking it all in. "He knew," she said, her voice dropping low and heavy. "He just didn't know when." She told him Thomas had left her a letter tucked inside the coat. It told her where to run, who to trust, and how to disappear with their children. Her jaw was tight as a fist. "He knew he was going to die, and he spent his last hours writing me a set of directions." Cole spoke gently. "He sure loved you." "He was a practical man," she replied, but her tone said she knew love and duty could live in the same heart, and Thomas McBride had been a master of both. Cole got up to tend the fire, mostly to give his hands something to do while his mind raced. When he turned back, Eleanor was already writing in a ledger. "These names on the left," she said, "are the men Piton paid to rubber stamp the Colville mine. Said it was safe just 6 weeks before the whole thing came down." She didn't bother to look up. The right column shows what it cost to buy their souls. The bottom has the dates. She flashed the page at him. Thomas had lined it all up perfectly. Cole saw the numbers, all precise, not a single one rounded off. These came from real books, real records. Then his eyes locked on a name, and he went still. "Harlan Driscoll," he said, "the county sheriff." She watched him close. "You know him?" Cole leaned back hard. "He's the law in this county. Came by my place a while back over a fence dispute." He stared at the number by Driscoll's name. $400, paid out months before the mine even collapsed. Piton was buying his cover before he even dug the graves. Cole could see the whole crooked picture now. This wasn't just some company cutting corners. This was a planned web of corruption. They bought the inspectors ahead of time and had the sheriff in their pocket. And when Thomas McBride found a loose thread and started pulling, they put him in the ground. Cole's mind snapped back to the present. "Your shoulder," he said suddenly. Eleanor blinked. "What about it?" He hated to ask, but he had to. "That fall you took from the wagon. Are you certain the baby is all right?" Eleanor froze for a second. For the first time, he saw past the iron will to the woman underneath, the one who was scared. "I don't know," she whispered, and it cost her dearly to admit it. He saw that plain as day. "I've felt movement, but not as much." Cole kept his voice steady. "The cold slows things down. But you tell me if that changes. I mean it." "I'm not stubborn about what matters," she said, picking up her pencil. "Oh, you're plenty stubborn," he said, "about the right things." A flicker of a smile touched her lips. "Thomas used to say I had the stubbornness of a woman who'd been told no one too many times." Cole almost grinned back. "Sounds like a smart man." "Smarter than me about people," she said, turning a page. He'd know in 5 minutes if a man was worth a damn. The air in the room shifted. "He would have trusted you." Cole was quiet for a long moment. "How can you be so sure?" She finally looked up, her gaze steady as a rock. "Because he kept your name. Thomas McBride didn't waste ink on men he didn't believe in." Her eyes held his. "Your name was on the second page he wrote. He listed you with the victims, not the witnesses." The fire crackled, the only sound in the cabin. The blizzard outside had settled into a low, mean hum, the kind that waits you out. But Cole wasn't the kind of man to give up. "I need to tell you something about Coleville," he said. "You don't owe me a thing." "No," he said. "I need to." He waited. "When I first filed my report on that collapse, I had proof. Pictures of the shoddy supports, testimony from miners. I had a copy of the inspection report signed by 2 of the fellas in your book." He nodded toward the ledger. "I had enough to shut Peton down for good." Eleanor didn't move a muscle. "My boss told me to stand down, that it was being handled higher up. Said I just had to trust the process." His jaw clenched. "So I did. I handed it all over. 3 weeks later, they gave me a new report to sign, clean as a whistle, no negligence. All my proof was labeled inconclusive, and a little note at the bottom said my job depended on my signature." "And you walked out," she stated. "I walked out," he confirmed. "Told myself it was enough that my hands were clean because I didn't sign the lie. But I took my files and I ran to Montana. I told myself just walking away was enough." He finally looked her in the eye, the weight of 2 years in his voice. "It wasn't. But my words just echoed in an empty room. It changed nothing. 7 good men were still gone. Piton kept his operation running, and I found a quiet little spot in the world to disappear into." Eleanor stared at him for a long moment. "Where are the files?" she asked. He met her gaze. "The proof? The pictures? The testimonies? The copy of that crooked inspection report?" She leaned in just a little. "Where are they?" "In a cedar chest, right under my bed." The look on Eleanor McBride's face was not victory, and it was not relief. It was the look of a woman who had carried a soul-crushing weight for 8 long months and had just found another pair of hands to help her lift it. "Cole," she said, "your files in Thomas's notebook, that is enough to see him hang." Cole said, "Yes, ma'am, I know." They looked at each other, the lantern burning low and steady between them. Outside, the blizzard howled, but inside, something had changed. The weight was still heavy, still dangerous, but now it was shared, and that changes everything. From the darkness by the wall, James McBride spoke. "How long have you been awake?" Cole asked the boy. "A while." The boy sat up, and his voice was careful. "Not the way a child is careful, but the way a man is. The kind of careful you learn when you know your words have consequences. I heard what you said about Clayville." Eleanor said his name, a soft warning in her tone. "He should know," James told his mother, not being defiant, just stating a fact. "He's helping us. He ought to know what he's getting into." Cole looked at the boy, all of 8 years old, already knowing that a fair deal requires the whole truth. He was Thomas McBride's son, all right. "What do you need to know?" Cole asked him. James took a moment to think, the same way he seemed to think about everything, slow and steady. "The men who were following us," he said, "are they going to come here?" "Not tonight," Cole told him. "The storm is too bad. Maybe in the morning." "And the sheriff? The one from your notebook?" "He's the law here," his mother confirmed. "So, we can't go to him," James said. "No?" The boy processed that. He looked back at Cole. "But you know other folks, people Peton does not own." "I know one man," Cole said, "a federal marshal named Garrett. He is 3 days east of here if the weather is clear. But it is not. But you can get a message to him. I can, if Peton's man has not gotten to the telegraph operator first." Cole looked at Eleanor. "That is our first move. At first light, I will ride to town and send that wire, and come back before Peton's men can pull themselves together." "That leaves us here by ourselves," James stated. "James," his mother began. "I am not complaining," the boy said. "I am figuring the angles." He looked at Cole with those dark, straight-on eyes. "What do we do if they show up while you are gone?" Cole leaned forward and gave James McBride the flat-out truth, because that is what the boy was asking for. "There is a rifle under the bed," he said. "It is loaded. Your mother knows how to use it." He glanced at Eleanor, and she gave a single firm nod. "If anyone comes knocking before I get back, you do not answer. You move to the back wall with your sister, and you let your mother handle that door." He held the boy's gaze. "Your job is your sister, just like it has been. You understand me?" James stared back for 3 solid seconds. Then he nodded. "Go back to sleep," Eleanor said softly. James laid back down, his arm going across his little sister Clara, a gesture both automatic and deliberate. In just a few minutes, his breathing was deep and even. Cole did not know how the boy did it, how he could just shut off the worry and go to sleep like a soldier in a trench. Eleanor watched her son for a long time, and her face held a look that was part grief and part pride. It was the look of a mother watching her child become something amazing under the worst circumstances imaginable, and not knowing whether she should be grateful or heartbroken over it. Cole did not look away. She would not want him to pretend he had not seen. "He is 8 years old," she said, her voice low. "I know." "He was 6 when Thomas started running into trouble at the mine. He has been watching me be scared for 2 years. She picked up her pencil. "And not once has he ever let me see him be scared." "He is scared," Cole said. "He has just decided it is not a useful feeling. That is what I am saying." She looked down at the notebook. He should not have had to decide that. Cole did not argue. She was right. He went to his mother's cedar chest, knelt down, and lifted the false bottom he had built in it years ago. A man never quite sheds old habits. He pulled out the files, wrapped in oilskin and tied with twine. He set them on the table, Eleanor looked at them, then at him. "Are you sure?" "I have been sure for 2 years," he said. "I just had not decided to do anything about it." She untied the twine, and opened the packet to the first photograph. He watched her as she studied the picture of the mine shaft supports, the places where the bracing had been cut away to save a few dollars on wood. She took it all in, seeing the whole picture before focusing on the details. Then she turned to the written testimonies and began to read. She read for 40 minutes without a word. Cole added wood to the fire and set a cup of hot water beside her. Outside, the dark of the blizzard began to change, turning from black to that deep gray blue that comes before the dawn. When she finished, she set the last page down. "The foreman who gave the order," she said. "His name was Marcus Hole. Yes, he is in Thomas's notebook." She did not look up. "He still works for Patton. He runs the new site north of Billings." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "He gave an order that killed 7 men, and now he is in charge of 300 more." "I know." She finally looked at him. "This has to end. Yes, ma'am." "Yes. I mean all of it," she said. "Not just Peaton. I mean Hole, Driscoll, every last name on that list, all of it." "That is what the federal courts are for," he said. "That is why we need Garrett." She was quiet for a second. Then she asked, "Cole, what if Garrett has been bought too?" It was the right question to ask. It was the question you ask when you have lived under a crooked system long enough to stop believing anyone is clean. "He might be," Cole said honestly. "But I have known Garrett for 12 years. Some men just cannot be bought, not because they are saints, but because they are too angry. Garrett had a brother die in a mine collapse back in Pennsylvania. He has been angry about it since 1869. Peaton does not have enough money to buy that man's anger." Eleanor held his gaze, and then something inside her seemed to settle. She had made her decision. "Send the wire at first light," she said, and went back to her work. Cole leaned back and watched over the room. He watched the children sleeping and the notebook and files spread across the table. It looked like the pieces of something that had been broken on purpose and was now being put back together by 2 people who had each been holding a different half. He did not feel the need for sleep. Something inside him that had been rusted shut for years was finally starting to turn again. The feeling was not comfortable. It was the ache of a broken thing learning how to work again. But it was working. When the first hint of gray touched the sky, he reached for his coat. "I will be back in 2 hours," he said. She nodded. Then, "Cole." He stopped. "The telegraph operator in Copper Falls is named Everett Kay. He's an old man. His daughter's husband was run out of a job by Peaton's foreman for complaining about safety." She held his eyes. "He is not owned by Peaton. Tell him Eleanor McBride sent you." "Thomas?" he said. "Thomas," she confirmed. "He knew everybody." Cole put on his coat and grabbed the rifle. He looked one last time at the table, at the files, and at Eleanor McBride. Her back straight in the dim light of the Montana dawn, her pencil still moving. 8 months along and still fighting. He looked at her then, a woman with 2 sleeping children and her dead husband's righteous fury spread across the table. He opened the door to the bitter cold. "Don't let Driscoll see you," Eleanor said, not even looking up from her work. "No, ma'am." He stepped out into the gray light of dawn. The world was buried in snow, looking pure and clean, but he knew better. He thought about a foreman, a crooked sheriff, and a rich man in Billings who'd been paying for accidents since 1875. He thought about Thomas McBride, writing a goodbye letter to his wife by lamplight. And he thought about 7 names that had been buried and carried in secret for 2 long years. He saddled his horse Pepper and rode toward Copper Falls. The whole world was holding its breath. It looked clean, but it was anything but. Everett Kane was already at his desk in the telegraph office. That meant word was already spreading through town, not by wire, but by whispers in the dark. Ever Kane looked up from his work, his face showing he was expecting someone he wasn't sure he wanted to see. Cole shut the door, dripping snowmelt onto the floorboards. "Eleanor McBride sent me," he said plainly. The old man set down his coffee cup. It wasn't surprise that crossed his face, but recognition. He'd been waiting for this knock for a long time. "Sit down," Kane said, his voice low, "and keep it quiet. Driscoll's deputy sleeps right across the street, and that fella's got big ears." Cole sat and laid out the whole story, quick and in order. The woman, her children, the notebook, and the urgent message that had to get to Marshal Garrett in Billings before their pursuers found them. Kane listened, taking it all in without a single interruption. He was a man who heard the entire message before he ever thought to reply. 4 days ago, headed north. A storm trapped him up at Ridgeline Station. Kane scribbled as he spoke. "Got a wire from the operator there yesterday. Garrett's stuck, same as the rest of us." He looked up at Cole. "But that means he's 2 hours north, not 3 days east, and he's been itching for a reason to ride." The old man paused. "I might have mentioned to that operator that some strange business down in Copper Falls could be of federal interest." Cole stared. "You knew about Eleanor." "I knew a woman was being hunted 2 days ago. My granddaughter saw their lanterns from her window." He kept writing, not missing a beat. "I've just been waiting for a name I recognized." He tore the page from his pad. "This gets to Garrett in 5 minutes. He can be here before noon." "What about Driscoll?" Cole asked. "He thinks he monitors my wires," Kane said, his voice flat as a skillet. "For 8 months, I've sent him a log that's true in every way except for the parts that count." He met Cole's gaze. "My son-in-law was a good man who asked too many questions. Some of us don't get to just walk away to Montana." Cole accepted the truth in that. "Send the wire," he said. Cole said, his voice low. The old man nodded and sent the message. Cole was back at the ranch well before anyone else had disturbed the fresh snow. He put Pepper in the barn, then walked to the cabin door. He knocked twice, paused, then knocked 3 more times. Bolt slid back and Eleanor opened the door, a rifle held loosely at her side. She didn't have to ask the question. "Garrett's 2 hours north at Ridgeline," he told her. "Kane sent him a wire. He ought to be here by noon." A flicker of something crossed her face, gone as quick as it came. "Kane knew," she breathed. "He's been waiting." She stepped aside. The cabin felt different. The table was clear, the files and notebook put away. Her son, James, stood watch at the window. Clara was awake, chewing on a dry biscuit from Cole's own supplies. "There's a man in the trees to the south," James said, his eyes fixed. "Been there 20 minutes. Just watching." Cole looked. The boy was right. A lone figure not moving, just waiting. "I see one," Cole confirmed. "One that I can see," James corrected him, just like a trained scout would. Cole glanced at Eleanor. "They're waiting," she said, "either for Driscoll or for more men." Cole stepped back from the window. "Either way, we need to be ready before Garrett gets here." He looked at James. "You know what to do. Back wall with your sister." "I heard you," James said, his tone matter-of-fact. Eleanor spoke quietly to her son. "James, take Clara to the back room now. Not because it's starting, but because I need to know you two are safe while I talk with Cole." The boy gave his mother a look, then took his sister's hand. Clara, biscuit in tow, went without a fuss. He shut the door behind them. Eleanor turned to Cole. "How many men does Peyton have around here?" "I know of 6, he answered, checking his rifle. "But Peyton won't come himself. He sends paperwork, then men. When the paper fails, he just sends more men." "The paperwork means nothing," Eleanor stated. "He has no legal claim on me or Thomas's notes. He doesn't need it to be legal," Cole said grimly. "He just needs it done before the law arrives." The unspoken truth hung between them. Outside, the man in the trees hadn't budged. Deputy, the dog, was at the door, coiled and ready. It was a stillness Cole had seen years ago, and he knew to trust it. "How's the shoulder?" he asked her. "I can manage," she said. "And the baby?" Her eyes met his, moving more than last night. He felt a wave of relief, stronger than he expected. "There's something else," she said, her voice dropping. "In the letter Thomas sent, he told me about a person to avoid." She folded her hands on the table. "He said if I made it to Montana, there was one man who could make this whole case impossible to ignore. A man with the proof and the motive to stand up in federal court." She stopped for a moment. "He wrote down your name." Cole stayed silent. "He gave a clear order with it," she explained. "He said to find Cole Hargrove. And when you do, tell him Thomas McBride said the men of Claville are still waiting for their names to be put in a document that will last." The fire crackled. The dog's ears twitched. Cole got up and walked to the window. Another figure had joined the first one in the trees. They were not moving closer, but they had spread out, using the trees for cover in a way that felt planned. "Look at how they're positioned," he said. Eleanor was right there beside him. "How long have they been there? 10 minutes, maybe not even that." He turned around. "The files, where are they?" "In the same spot you left them." She went to the cedar chest, knelt, and lifted the hidden bottom. He saw his oilskin pouch next to the notebook and the copied papers, all tucked away in the dark. She put the board back and stood. "They will not find it with a quick look. It is not a quick look that I am worried about." He grabbed the rifle. "Eleanor." She looked at him. "I need you to do something that will feel completely wrong." She folded her arms, listening but not agreeing just yet. "When they come, and they are coming, I need you to let me be the one to answer the door. Let me face them and trust that I can hold them off until Garrett gets here. And if he is not on time, I will hold them off anyway. And what gives you the right? You are just a rancher. You do not have a badge. I have the original Claville papers, a witness statement, and your husband's notebook right there in a cedar chest. And the second Garrett steps inside, everything in this house becomes federal evidence. And anyone who tried to get to it becomes a federal problem." He looked her straight in the eye. "But that only works if we are all still here when he arrives." Eleanor stared at him. You could see her weighing every option, not because she was slow, but because she was careful. "All right," she finally said. She went to the back room door. "James." The door swung open right away. The boy had been waiting. "Come here." James walked over. Eleanor knelt down to face her son, placing her hands on his shoulders. "I need you to listen to me very, very carefully." "I always listen," he replied. "I know you do," she said, her voice calm and sure. "The men outside work for the man who hurt your father. They want what is in that chest. They will not get it. Cole will make sure of it. But you have to stay in the back room with, your sister. Keep her calm and trust me." James looked from his mother to Cole. "The marshal is on his way," Cole told him. 2 hours, give or take. We just need to run out the clock." The boy, all of 8 years old, seemed to understand. He stood up a little straighter, a habit Cole had noticed before. It was the boy's own way of setting his jaw, just like his mother. He gave a nod. "Do not let them come in," James said to Cole. "No, sir," Cole promised. James went back to his sister and shut the door. The knock on the front door came about 12 minutes later. It was a hard, solid knock, the kind made by a man who either had a badge or was pretending to. Cole was already there. Eleanor sat at the table, her hands where they could be seen. The rifle was leaning against a wall 6 feet away. Cole opened the door. Sheriff Harlan Driscoll stood on the porch with 2 other men. He had the look of someone given a bad job who just wanted to get it over with. He was in his 50s, a heavy man with a badge that shone in the dim morning light. "Morning, Cole." Driscoll's voice was flat, like he was reading from a script. "I have a warrant here from Judge Alderman over in Billings. We are looking for a woman named Eleanor McBride, wanted for taking documents that belong to the Peaton Mining Company." He held the paper out, but Cole did not take it. "You seen anybody on the road these past 2 days?" "A woman with dark hair, pregnant, with 2 children." "Roads have been closed, Harlan." "Blizzard," Cole said. Driscoll's jaw clenched. "I will need to come inside and look. You have a search warrant to go with that one?" Driscoll paused for just a second too long. A retrieval warrant is for a person, Cole said calmly, not for searching a man's home. To search my house, you need a different paper from a different judge. And the closest judge, who is not alderman, is 3 days away. He stared at Driscoll. You know the law, Harlan. You have been a lawman long enough. Driscoll looked back, and in his eyes, Cole saw a man at a fork in the road, forced to choose between what he had been doing and what he knew was right. Cole, Driscoll said, his voice now quiet. Do not make this difficult. I am not making anything difficult. I am just standing here in my own house. The real question is what you are doing, Harlan, and who you are doing it for. One of the men with Driscoll, a younger fellow who was tired of waiting, stepped up. Sheriff, the warrant says we can... Stand down, Driscoll ordered sharply. The man froze. Driscoll looked at Cole, and a flicker of something that resembled courage crossed his face. I have a daughter, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Paton holds the note on my house. If I do not do this... I know, Cole said. And he truly did. He knew it the second he saw Driscoll's name in that notebook, with $400 written next to it. The date was the same month Driscoll's daughter got sick. The doctor bills were high, and the man who offered to pay them did not seem like a monster at the time. I know how it all started, Harlan. A complicated, painful look passed over Driscoll's face. There is a federal marshal coming, Cole told him. He will be here in 2 hours, maybe less. What you do right now is going to matter a whole lot more than anything you have done for the past 2 years. You know your name is in that book. And you know a federal court will treat a sheriff who backed away from an illegal search a lot better than one who kicked down a door. The younger man behind Driscoll moved his hand toward his gun. The sound that stopped him was not the rifle. It was Deputy, the old dog, who stepped to Cole's side and let out a low growl from deep in his chest. The man's hand stopped. Do not, Driscoll said quietly but firmly to his man. He was finally making the choice he had been putting off for 2 years. He folded the warrant and tucked it into his coat. He gave Cole one last look that was hard to read. It was not quite shame, but it was not relief either. 2 hours, he said. 2 hours, Cole repeated. Driscoll turned and walked off the porch, his men following a moment later. Cole stood in the doorway, watching them ride away before he finally let out his breath. Eleanor was right behind him. You heard all that? He asked. I heard, she said. She was holding the rifle now, just holding it. His daughter, she murmured. That is how Paton operates. He finds a man's weakness and offers to help, and after that he owns the man. Cole shut the door. It is a clean and patient kind of evil, and it makes it mighty hard for a man to ever walk away because he agreed to the help in the first place. Paton builds a cage of favors around a man, Eleanor explained, repeating her husband's words. Then, when he needs something done, the cage does the work for him. She set her rifle down. Thomas said the only way out is to make staying in more costly than leaving. That's what just happened with Driscoll, Cole realized. She looked toward the door. He could still wire Paton, but he didn't search this house when he had the numbers to do it, and I was alone. That tells me he's thinking hard on which side he's on. The back room door opened. James came out with Clara right behind him, finishing her biscuit. They left? The boy asked. They left, Cole confirmed. Clara looked from the dog to Cole, then to her mother. Deputy was very loud, she announced with approval. He sure was, Cole agreed. Clara went and sat right beside the big dog, claiming him as her own. Deputy just sighed and laid his head back down, the closest thing to a welcome he'd shown anyone in years. Eleanor put a hand on James's shoulder and the boy leaned into her touch, finally letting go of some of the weight he'd been carrying. The next 2 hours stretched on forever. Cole fed the horses and walked the property line twice. He came back inside to find Eleanor at the table, just sitting with a cup in her hands, staring off at nothing. What will you do? He asked her. After all this is over? After Garrett? After the federal case? After Paton is dealt with? He sat down across from her. What does Eleanor McBride do then? She was quiet for a long moment, looking at the faint ink stains on her knuckles. I want to teach, she said, her voice clear and sure. It was a dream she had held on to through everything. I want to find a place with children who need a teacher. I want to do what I was meant to do. She paused, her gaze softening. I want Clara to grow up knowing how to read any contract put in front of her. And I want James to know there are good systems in this world, because good people fight to make them that way. That is a whole lot of hoping for one soul, she just said. I have been biding my time. Cole looked at her, really looked at this woman. She had squared her shoulders and walked right through a blizzard. She had stayed up all night making copies of evidence. She had stared down a sheriff's knock at her door and never once asked for a bit of pity. Cole said real slow, I think Thomas McBride was the kind of man who would have been proud to know you ended up safe, with a good school, a strong lock on your door, and children who knew they were loved. Eleanor met his gaze for a long moment. Her chin trembled just a little, that tiny movement a person makes when they are holding back a flood of emotion. He would have liked knowing I was done running, she said. Then the sound of horses came from the north road. It was not a posse, not a quiet approach. It was steady and sure, the sound of men who had business to attend to and no reason to hide it. Cole was at the window in a heartbeat. He saw 4 horses, and a badge glinting in the midday sun. Clara, sitting on the floor, looked from Cole to her mother, then to the door. Is that the good man? She asked. Eleanor went to the window to see. A wave of something that had been building for 8 long months and 4 hard days washed over her. It was not victory. It was that feeling you get when you have been just trying to survive for so long and you suddenly realize you can finally breathe again. Yes, honey, she said. That is the good man. Cole opened the door. Marshal Thomas Garrett rode into the yard, 3 deputies right behind him. He looked like a man who had been waiting for this news for 4 days straight and rode out the second he got it. He pulled his horse to a stop at the porch. His gaze passed over Cole and landed on Eleanor, standing in the doorway. Mrs. McBride, he said. Marshal, she answered. I believe you are looking for some papers concerning the Peaton Mining Company and the Colville mine collapse. I have Thomas's notebook, 2 full copies, and Cole Harrow's original investigation files. Her voice was steady as a rock. 73 pages of evidence in all. Garrett looked at Cole. The original files. It was not a question, but he needed to hear it. In the cedar chest, Cole said, safe and sound. Garrett swung down from his horse. He was a solid, thoughtful man with tired eyes that saw everything. He had the kind of stillness that comes from being angry for a very long time and learning how to make that anger useful. Well then, I reckon we have some work to do, he said. He stepped onto the porch, and as Cole moved aside, Marshal Thomas Garrett walked right into that little cabin. 7 good men from Coville were dead, and the proof lay hidden in an oilskin envelope. All that was left was the hard work of making sure their names were not forgotten. U.S. Marshal Garrett was the man for that job. He worked slow and steady without any fuss, reading every single page of evidence. He read the dead man's notebook, then Cole's old files, and finally the pages Eleanor had copied all night long. While he worked, Cole put on a pot of real coffee. His little girl, Clara, took it upon herself to serve the cups, walking with the serious purpose of a child who has found her place in the world. James, the boy, just sat at the end of the table and watched the marshal with a quiet, patient stare. After nearly an hour, Garrett finally looked up, his eyes landing right on James. He asked, Your father wrote this? Yes, sir, James answered. Garrett nodded, looking back at the neat handwriting. He wrote like a lawyer, he said, not as a compliment, but as a fact. He understood that this man, Thomas, had built a case that was airtight, predicting every argument. He knew it was going to a court. He always knew, James said softly. A brief flicker of something moved in the marshal's tired eyes before he returned to his reading. Garrett never looked up from the papers. He said, Judge Alderman, who signed Driscoll's warrant, just moved to the top of my list. Cole watched him work, leaning against a wall. Outside, one of the deputies stood guard on the porch. No one had to say that Pétain's men were still out there, hidden in the trees. It was a waiting game, a question of whose time would run out first. Finally, Garrett stacked the last page neatly. He looked straight at Cole and said, "Tell me about the night you wrote that first report." So Cole sat down and told him the whole story, plain and simple, from start to finish. When Cole was done, Garrett said, "Your old supervisor, Harlan Beaumont, died 18 months back. It was called a carriage accident." He let that sink in. "Pétain has a man in Chicago who arranges those kinds of accidents." He looked right at Cole. "Your story connects the whole rotten business. That gives us a federal conspiracy charge that no crooked local judge can touch." Eleanor spoke from the window. "You've been building this case." "For 16 months, Garrett admitted. "I had the pieces, but not the thing that held them all together." He tapped Thomas's notebook. "Your husband gave me the architecture of their whole operation." Garrett's voice was steady. "Now, I need you to understand what's coming. I'm going to arrest Augustus Pétain today, but the moment I do, his lawyers will try to tear you down. They will attack your past, your marriage, and say your husband faked all of this." Eleanor walked to the table and sat down, planting her hands firmly on the wood. "I was a school teacher for 9 years, she said, her voice clear and strong. "I am 8 months pregnant, I have been on the run for 4 days, and I spent last night copying 73 pages of evidence. I believe a court will see my commitment to the truth." A small, brief smile touched Garrett's lips. "I need you in Billings for the hearing, 3 or 4 weeks. You will testify on Thomas's documents." He then faced Cole. "You will testify about the Colville files and the falsified report." "When do you leave for Pétain's?" Cole asked. "This afternoon. I need to get there before his men do." Garrett stood. "Fitch and Reyes are staying to guard you." Clara looked up at the marshal. "Are you going to put the bad man in jail?" Garrett, a man clearly not used to children, replied, "Yes, miss." "Good," she said with finality. He then gathered the documents, stacking them neatly, from the copies. He secured the papers inside his coat and was almost to the door when Eleanor said, "Marshal." He stopped. "A man named Marcus Holt runs Pétain's northern operation. He ordered the bracing removed at Colville." Her voice was level. "He is still giving orders. There were 300 men in that shaft." Garrett turned. "He is on page 14, payments for operational adjustments." Thomas believed that was code for removing safety measures, she said. "It was," Cole confirmed. 3 survivors used that phrase. Garrett wrote in his notebook, "I will have a deputy at that shaft tomorrow." "Thank you, Mrs. McBride." "Thank Thomas," she replied. He put on his hat and walked out. They heard him give orders, then horses moving south. The sound of horses moving south at a purposeful pace. A deep quiet settled over the cabin, the kind that follows when something big has finally been set in motion. James looked at his mother. "Is it over?" he asked. Eleanor looked at her son, choosing her words with care. "The hardest part is nearly done. What comes next will be hard in a different way." James seemed to understand. "You have to testify in court." "Yes." The boy turned to Cole. "Will you be there?" Cole looked at the family around him and the empty spot on the table where the notebook had been. "Yes," he said, "I will be there." James nodded once decisively and returned to his sister. The afternoon passed slowly. Aftermath of a blizzard. Fitch was 22 from Ohio and very polite. He helped Cole with the horses. In the barn, Fitch talked, not from nerves, but to fill the silence. He spoke of being a deputy for 6 months and of his brother, a miner in Ohio, he wrote to Weekly. Cole listened, realizing the young man had not yet fully connected this case to his own brother's safety. One day he would. When they returned, Eleanor was at the table with Thomas's notebook. It was open to his personal notes, written in a much looser hand. She closed it as they came in, not secretively, just privately. "Clara's asleep," she said. "James found your surveying book from 1871 and has been reading it for 2 hours and has asked me 4 questions about land measurement that I could not answer." A hint of warmth touched her voice. He may have a future in surveying, Cole mused. He thinks like Thomas, she said simply. Her tone made it feel like he was still present. Cole sat down across from her. "Can I ask you something?" he began. "That night on the ridge, you had a knife in the floorboards. You used it to try and stand. You were not giving up." "No," she confirmed. "What was your plan?" She was quiet for a second. "Get the children moving north. Then I would draw the men with the lanterns south. I knew where the rifle was. I just needed them to follow me." Her hands were flat on the table. "I had not figured out the next part," she admitted. "That is not a plan," Cole said. "It is a sacrifice." "It was what I had," she answered, unapologetic. "My children, the notebook, and men right above us. You use what is available. You work with what you have," Cole repeated. "Thomas wrote instructions for you. You followed them. When you ran out of road on that ridge, you made your own way." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. What other choice was there? It was a genuine question. "None," he said. "There was no other choice. I just want you to know that I saw what you did. Because when a crisis ends, people can forget the extraordinary things they did alone in the dark. None of it was small. And I wanted someone to have said that out loud before the federal courthouse makes it official and the lawyers make it language and the record makes it history." He met her eyes. It was extraordinary. "You are extraordinary. And Thomas McBride knew that when he married you, and he knew it when he wrote those instructions, and he knew it was true, even if he did not make it out to see it finished." Eleanor was quiet for a long while. It was the quiet that comes after a large truth has been spoken. When she spoke, her voice was steady in a different way, relieved. "He used to say I was the only person he ever met who feared failing at important things more than the consequences of fighting for them." She looked at the closed book. He meant it as a compliment. "It took me a while to see it that way." Cole remained silent. There was nothing more that needed to be said. Later, a quiet settled over the cabin. The sky turned a deep winter blue, and the first stars appeared over the snowy peaks. A young deputy named Fitch ate cold biscuits in the corner, while James asked him questions about measuring land. Little Clara woke up and asked for a biscuit too, so Cole started making more. It was the first truly ordinary hour in that cabin in days. It was the kind of peace you only find after a great storm has passed. Eleanor just sat and drank her coffee, watching her children. Every now and then she would look over at Cole, and in her eyes was a look he was just beginning to understand. Being ready for a fight isn't the point. The point is whether the fight is necessary. Cole figured that out on a snowy road when he saw Eleanor McBride, a woman who had every right to stay down, drive a knife into a wagon board just to pull herself up. They were headed to federal court to speak the truth, and this story is about how difficult truths can sometimes lead you home. He sat on the porch in the cold, thinking about what it would mean to stand in that courtroom, and finally set the record straight. The question had been settled. The door opened behind him, and Eleanor came out, moving with the careful weight of a woman far along with child. They stood together under the stars, sharing a silence that spoke louder than words. It was the kind of quiet two people earn after surviving something terrible together. 3 weeks in Billings, she said at last. 3 weeks, he agreed. She kept looking at the stars, thinking out loud. The children need a place to settle down, a school, something that isn't always moving. "Montana is good for schools," Cole said. "The territory's been building them for years." She gave him a sideways glance. "You have looked into it." "I read," was all he said. She turned back to the sky. "Copper Falls has a school building. The teacher left for Denver 8 months ago, and they have been trying to find a new one." A heavy silence settled between them. "Cole," she said, "are you telling me about a job, or are you giving me a reason to stay?" He met her gaze, his own just as honest. "I reckon I'm telling you both," he said. "It is up to you to decide which one you heard." Eleanor was quiet for a long while, the kind of quiet that comes after a blizzard scrubs the whole world clean. "The baby is going to need a name," she finally said. "I have been thinking on it, but nothing feels right." She looked down at her hands resting on the rail. "Thomas, my husband, he had a name picked out. He wrote it to me in a letter. He said if we had a girl, he wanted to name her after the first honest thing that happened after all the lies." She looked straight at Cole, her voice barely a whisper. He never got to see it happen. He only had the hope of it. Cole looked at this woman who was about to walk into a federal courthouse and speak a truth that could cost her everything. "What was the name?" he asked gently. "Verity," she said. "It means truth." The cold wind blew between them, carrying the deep silence of a Montana winter. "That is a good name," Cole said. Eleanor nodded and then turned to go back inside, and he held the door for her. They left for Billings 4 days later, once the roads were clear. Word had come from Garrett that Peyton was arrested, just gave up right in his office without a fight. Holt was taken at the North Mine. The 300 workers there were sent home with pay while honest men inspected the shaft. The morning before they left, Sheriff Driscoll showed up at the ranch. He came alone, with his hat in his hands, looking like a man who had wrestled with his own soul and lost. "I need to speak to Mrs. McBride," he said. Cole called her to the door, and she stood there watching him, waiting. "I knew about the notebook," Driscoll said, his voice low. "I knew your husband was keeping records, and I knew Peyton wanted them. When they told me he had an accident, I just filed the report they gave me. I did not ask the questions I should have." He finally looked her in the eye. "I am sorry, Mrs. McBride, for all of it." Eleanor was quiet, judging not the apology, but the man giving it. "Did you have a choice?" she asked. "Not a good one," Driscoll admitted. "But yes, I had one. Then I accept your apology, Sheriff, and I suggest you tell the federal court exactly what you just told me. A man who makes a bad choice is one thing. A man who makes it and then tells the truth about it, well, the court will see the difference." Driscoll nodded slowly, put his hat on, and rode away. "That was generous," Cole said, standing beside her in the doorway. "It was accurate," she replied. "There is a difference." The trip to Billings took 2 days. Their daughter Clara sang songs the whole way, while their son James watched the passing land like he was memorizing the way home. On the second evening, with the lights of the town glowing in the distance, Eleanor spoke without looking at him. "Thomas proposed to me in a schoolroom." Cole turned to her. "I was at my desk. He had come to fix the stovepipe. He was awful at it. It took him 3 visits to get it right." The memory brought a warmth to her voice, a small, hopeful light against the cold. It was that mix of sweet and painful that does not have a proper name. On his 3rd visit, he told me he was making things worse on purpose between visits, just so he would have a reason to come back. She stared out at the distant lights. I told him that was the sorriest excuse for a courtship I had ever heard. He just said being efficient was not the point. The point was just showing up. She paused. And he showed up every single day for the rest of his life. Cole rode beside her in the quiet dark. "He sounds like a man worth finishing this for," Cole said. "He was," she said softly. "He still is." They got to Billings the next morning. Garrett met them at the edge of town with 2 more deputies. He looked like a man in a hurry. "Piton's lawyers are trying to get the case thrown out," Garrett said right off the bat. "They are arguing that Thomas McBride's papers were seized without a warrant, so they cannot be used." He looked at Eleanor. "They are going to claim the copies you made are fakes." "Then I will recite the originals from memory," Eleanor said, "word for word if I have to." Garrett just looked at her, a flicker of a smile in his tired eyes. He watched her with that same look he had back at the ranch, like a man holding dynamite and timing the fuse. The hearing was in 2 days. "Good," she answered. "I have been ready for 8 months. That federal courthouse in Billings was the kind of place built to make a person feel small, with stone columns that declared the system's power before you even set foot inside." Cole had been in courtrooms before and was never much bothered by them. What got to him was the way every eye in that room turned when Eleanor McBride walked in. There were lawyers in fancy suits, a judge on his high bench, and a gallery packed with folks who had only heard whispers of the story. and came to see the whole truth. She walked with her back straight, wearing a simple dark dress bought with the last of Thomas's emergency money. With a pencil callus on her finger, an ink stain on her knuckle, and carrying 8.5 months of their child, she took her seat in the witness chair like a woman who belonged there. Piton's lawyer, a man named Voss from Chicago, was expensive and carried the confidence of a man who had twisted words for 20 years. He let Eleanor tell her story for a good hour about Thomas's notes, the ledger, and the copies. Then he stood up, looking at her with the practiced patience of the man who thinks he has an easy fight. Mr. Voss said, "Mrs. McBride, you claim to have understood these business ledgers, but you have no legal schooling. Why should this court trust the word of someone not qualified to read such documents?" "I taught mathematics for 9 years," Eleanor replied calmly. "I can read a column of numbers, and I can read a contract. What I saw in those books did not require a fancy education. It just required literacy and attention." She met his gaze. "I have both. Your copies were made from memory, you said." "From the notebook I held in my hand," she corrected, "and from memory, where the pages were torn." She pulled a paper from her folder. "I can prove it. Give me any page from the original ledger, and I will tell you every word on it before you open it." A low murmur spread through the gallery. Voss glanced at the page, then at his own table, then to the judge. "That will not be necessary," he said. "Oh, I think it might be," Judge Forsythe said from the bench. He looked like a man who had been waiting for a case just like this one, and was not about to be rushed. Voss chose a page from Piton's ledger. He read a single line from it. Eleanor recited it back perfectly, right down to the date in the corner and the account number at the bottom. Voss picked another page. She repeated that one too, even pointing out 2 little reference notes that Voss himself had missed at first. The gallery's murmur grew a little louder. "Mrs. McBride," Voss said, and his voice was different now. Not shaken, but adjusted, like a traveler who finds the trail is not what the map promised. "Your husband, you admitted, was very emotionally caught up in this. Is it not possible his notes reflect what he wanted to find, instead of the facts?" "Thomas was an accountant," she said. "Accountants write down what the numbers say, and the numbers he copied came from Mr. Piton's own books." She paused for a moment. "If those documents show a predetermined conclusion, it was predetermined by Augustus Piton when he wrote them, not by my husband when he copied them." For the next 40 minutes, Voss tried to trip her up, but Eleanor met every question with the same calm, steady truth. She had lived with these facts for 8 long months and knew them better than the high-priced lawyer paid to tear them down. Cole testified the next day. He told the court, plain and simple, what happened at Cleville. He spoke of the real report and the fake one his boss told him to sign. Then, in a quiet courtroom, he named the 7 men whose names had been erased from the record, finally giving them their place back in the story. Voss questioned him for an hour. Cole answered every question with the same straightforward honesty he had learned from Eleanor, a quality he had always had, but had mostly used on horses instead of men. When Voss asked why he had kept quiet for 2 years, Cole looked straight at the gallery. "Because I was wrong not to speak up, and I knew it," he said. "But knowing did not make me act, not until a woman drove a knife into a wagon board in a blizzard and used it to stand. I figured if she could do that, I could do this." The whole room was completely silent. Mr. Voss sat down. On the 3rd day, a lawman named Garrett took the stand and laid out 16 months of detective work, showing the whole corrupt pattern that Thomas McBride's notebook first uncovered. He took his time, making sure every single word counted. All the while, Piton sat at his table dressed in a fine suit, looking like a man watching a building he thought he owned come crashing down around him. Cole had seen that look before on men who build their fortunes thinking the people they harm are too broken to ever speak the truth. He was wrong. They always are. The verdict came on the 5th day. Guilty. Guilty on 11 counts, from fraud and criminal negligence to conspiracy. Another man, a judge who had been arrested mid-hearing, took a plea deal and gave up names. 3 of those men were sitting right there in the gallery and were quietly escorted out by federal deputies. Peyton's lawyer immediately filed for an appeal, just as Garrett said he would. But it would not matter much for now. Peyton was to be held without bail. The judge had read Thomas's notebook and knew exactly what kind of man he was dealing with, a man who arranged accidents for people who knew too much. When the verdict was read, Eleanor sat between Cole and her son James, her daughter Clara asleep beside her. She sat perfectly still as the judge's voice read out the list of crimes. Her son's hand found hers, and she squeezed it tight. She did not cry. She did not make a sound. She just sat with her eyes fixed forward, her jaw set, her husband's notebook safe in the bag at her feet. She let the truth settle in the air for a full minute before she finally moved. Then she breathed out, a long, slow, complete exhale. It was the sound of a woman finally setting down a heavy burden she had carried for 8 long months over a hard and lonely road. Outside on the courthouse steps, Garrett came to stand with them in the cold air. He shook Cole's hand and then looked at Eleanor with that same expression he'd had from the very beginning. He was the man with the dynamite, except now the fuse had burned all the way down. The job was done, and what was left on his face was a deep and quiet respect for the woman who had dared to light it. Something quieter. He had the look of a man who had carried a grudge for a long time over his brother's death in a Pennsylvania mine and had finally seen justice served. "Your testimony was the thing that sealed it," Garrett told Eleanor. "Without that notebook, and without you sitting in that chair reading from it, Voss would have found a way to wiggle free." He paused for a moment. "Thomas built the case, but you are the one who delivered it." Eleanor looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "The 7 men from Coffville," she said. "Will their names be in the federal record?" Garrett answered without a second of hesitation. "Every single one of them. They will be in every document this case produces from this day forward." She gave a single firm nod. "Then it is finished." Garrett put his hat on and went back inside. There was more work to do, and he was not the kind of man to leave a job half done. James looked up at Cole and asked, "What happens now?" Cole looked at the boy, at the woman beside him, and at the little girl who was now awake and studying the courthouse pillars. "Now," Cole said, "we go home." They headed back to Copper Falls in the first week of December, right when the deep winter had settled over the land. The school building was standing just as Cole had promised. It was solid and well built, cold from not being used, but the structure was sound, and it had a good stove. Eleanor walked through it alone that first afternoon. She came back with snow on her boots and a list of supplies she had written on a piece of brown paper from her coat pocket. She placed the list on the table between them, and Cole read it. "You'll need a second bookshelf," he said. "I know. Can you build one?" "I can build 2, he replied. She met his eyes across the table. The fire was crackling and the children were settled in the back room. James was already reading his surveying book for the 3rd time. Deputy the dog was asleep by the hearth. "Cole," she said, and then she waited. "Thomas showed up every day," she told him, her eyes locked on his. "That is what I told you on the road. And I need you to know that is what I need. Not a big rescue, just someone who shows up." He held her gaze. "Eleanor," he said, "I walked a lame horse 4 miles in a blizzard. I stood on your porch with a shotgun for 12 hours, and I testified in a federal court against a man paid to make good people look small." He let that sink in. "I reckon I know how to show up." And just like that, the wall she kept around herself came down. He saw the real Eleanor with nothing held back. She reached across the table and took his hand. Her grip was hard and certain, the same way it had been on the courthouse steps in Billings. He held on. Verity Callahan was born on the 21st of December, the longest night of the year in Montana. She came into the world strong and screaming with her mother's dark hair and a will that was all her own, and Cole held her first, because Eleanor's hands were still shaking, and someone needed to be steady. He looked at that tiny face and thought about Thomas McBride writing in his notebook by lamplight, trying to get some truth down on paper before his time ran out. Verity, Eleanor said from the bed. Her voice was exhausted but fierce. Her name is Verity. Cole brought the baby to her. As Eleanor held her daughter for the first time, her expression was that of a woman who had fought through impossible odds to get to this very moment. In the doorway, James stood with Clara asleep on his shoulder. He looked at his mother and his new sister with the same careful eyes that had been watching over his family since he was 6 years old. And for the first time, Cole saw those eyes finally rest. The school opened in January with 11 students. Eleanor told them on the first day that any paper they could read was a paper they could understand, and any paper they could understand could not be used against them. Word spread fast in that small territory. By February, she had 19 students. Eleanor McBride became Eleanor Hargrove on a quiet Sunday that same month. When the school board from another district wrote to ask what her secret was, she told them the simple truth. She was teaching them to read everything. Cole built the second bookshelf in March. He built a third one in April because her collection of books grew faster than they expected. This led to the kind of laughter that only exists between two people who have been through fire together and found each other on the other side. Garrett wrote to them from Billings. Peaton's appeal was denied. Holt's conviction was upheld. The federal record was permanent. The names of the miners were in it for good. The northern mine shaft was closed for a full safety inspection, one that Garrett watched over himself with 3 engineers who could not be bought. Driscoll resigned his post in February and got a job at a feed store 1 county over. Garrett wrote that it was the right outcome for a man who made a bad choice and then a better one. The names of the 7 men from Coville were in the verdict, and in a separate document Garrett filed himself. It listed every single person harmed by the Piton Mining Company between 1873 and 1878. Thanks to Thomas's notebook, it was a very long list. On a morning in late spring, the ranch was alive with the sounds of new horses and Clara's chatter. Eleanor sat on the porch with her coffee and Thomas's notebook. She was not looking at the pages of evidence, but at the back pages, where a man had written his own thoughts just for himself. She sat on the courthouse steps, reading in the quiet of the morning. When Cole came out and sat beside her, she didn't hide the notebook, and he didn't pretend not to see it. "He wrote about you," she said, her voice soft. Cole just looked at her. She turned to the last page, written in November, right before the accident, and held it for him to read. The handwriting belonged to Thomas McBride, small and careful, like a man who knew any words could be his last. He wrote that if the worst should happen, there was only one man he trusted to have the grit and the reason to use the proof he'd gathered. That man was a former Pinkerton agent named Cole Hargrove, who had already proven he would walk away from a job before he'd sign his name to a lie. Eleanor pointed to the page. Thomas wrote that he did not know how to find Cole, but hoped Cole might find his way to her instead. 3 weeks before it all happened, the morning was bright and warm. It was the kind of Montana spring morning that makes you understand why folks put down roots in this land and never let go. The sound of Verity's voice, a determined 5-month-old, drifted from the open window. Then came her sister Clara's patient answer, the tone of a 6-year-old who has taken it upon herself to explain the world. James's boots sounded on the porch, but he stopped when he saw his mother and Cole, deciding to give them their moment. Eleanor closed the notebook. She held it with both hands, the same way she had clutched it through the blizzard and the hearing and all the days since. Then she placed it carefully on the step next to her. It was the way you set down a heavy load, not letting it go, but finally allowing yourself to stand up straight. She gazed out at the horses in the morning light. The fence Cole had fixed back in March stood straight and true, and the big cottonwood trees were getting their leaves back. "He found you," she said, not to Cole or herself, but to the morning air. It was a simple truth, finally given the space it deserved. Cole reached over and took her hand. Thomas McBride had stood for what was right every single day, until the day they made sure he could not stand anymore. But in the notebook he left behind, in the names he refused to let be forgotten, he was still standing. In the woman he trusted to carry his truth, and the man he hoped would help her bring it home, Thomas was showing up still. As Eleanor had told her students on a cold January morning, some people leave this world with less truth in it than they found. Thomas had left it with more. That was the real measure of the man, something truer than any courthouse document. He was a man who held on to the truth right up to the end, and she was the woman who carried it across the finish line. Together, they had made sure that what was done in the dark was dragged out into the daylight, named for what it was, and recorded for good. It was now part of the world, where it could never be lost again. And that was enough. In fact, that was everything. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.